Hi guys, we'll be taking a look at medieval India today, but before we get started, does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, etc.? Okay, all right, so getting close to the end of the semester, the two lectures really we have left to take a look at, we're going to look at India in the medieval period, and we'll look at China in the medieval period, and that'll take us through the remainder of the course. Remember, the course ends in 1300 CE, so this essentially the medieval period is really the last period, major period that we're going to cover as far as a unit. Now, if you're interested in the 100 Years' War and those things, go ahead and take a look at the second part of the class, which is World Civ II. But for the sake of World Civ I, today we'll be looking at medieval India, and we'll really trace it from the last of the Guptas, which is where we basically left off with the ancient lecture, and then taking it all the way through the medieval period through a dynasty known as the Delhi Sultanate. So we'll spend a lot of time on the Delhi Sultanate today, really focusing on it and its role in India. So as mentioned before, this class kind of differs from a Western Civ class, and that Western Civ kind of focuses more on the Western world. And this class obviously takes a look at world cultures from beyond just the West. And certainly India is one of those places that has a major impact on our society, from the invention of chess, surgeries, smallpox vaccination, the numerical system that we use, Damascus steel. Those are just, a sampling of some of the things that Indian craftsmen and Indian doctors were able to create. So their influence on our society is tremendous. And so it's important to trace their lineage, right, by looking at their history. And so that's what we'll do today is we'll basically spend much of the day today looking at Indian history. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Delhi Sultanate in medieval India. So this will really cover about 500 years today, maybe a little bit more, really about 1000-ish, 900-ish to about 1526 CE. And we'll really be looking primarily at the Delhi Sultanate, but we'll also take a look at what's going on in southern India. The Delhi Sultanate didn't control southern India. We had independent city-states that were there. And we'll also take a look at what's going on in Sri Lanka as well. So all of those are things that we'll be covering in today's lecture. So the first thing to understand about what's going on in India is during this time period, India is being invaded by groups from Afghanistan, which particularly we refer to as Turks, Turkish invaders. As mentioned in this class on numerous occasions, we've talked about the Turks. They played a major role in the Abbasid Caliphate. They play a large role, obviously, in taking over Egypt. And then they play a big role as well in knocking out the Byzantine Empire. So the Turks, obviously the Central Asian nomadic peoples, they end up essentially attacking India as well through Afghanistan. And although most of them were illiterate, they did have a very rich Persian culture that they brought with them. The Persian language was part of this. We're going to see that Islam, many of them are very fervently Islam. They're going to bring that into India as well. And so there are some aspects of the Turkish invasions that will change India in some fundamental ways. The thing to understand about India is that much of India's history is essentially written by invaders who conquered it. India was always an attraction because of its wealth. There's a lot of spices that grow there. You have a lot of gems that can be mined there. It's a very wealthy place. And so it tended to be a big target. And many of the local religions, especially Hinduism, tended to be nonviolent. And so this largely made it a huge target for peoples who wanted to use ATM as or use India as an ATM, which they effectively did. And the Afghanis are going to be part of that. So we're going to see how Islamic influence is going to change India. But before we talk about that, we'll talk about the actual conquest itself. So really in about 1000, we have a series of invasions from Afghanistan that are led by a guy by the name of Mahmud of Ghazni, who had the nickname the Sword of Islam. And so basically Mahmud of Ghazni is the guy that you see here. He's going to lead, I think, 13, 14 different plundering expeditions into India. And those expeditions were very successful in bringing a variety of goods and wealth into his dynasty. So these are mostly large scale raids. and then basically taking back all the things that they want to his own kingdom. Eventually, he's able to do this because of his military tactics. Like other Turks, he had superior cavalry. The Turks were some of the best light cavalry in the world. They were particularly excellent horse archers. And so they basically would play, catch me if you can kind of game where they would, shoot at the Indian troops. And then when the Indians would get too close, they would, essentially retreat while shooting back at them, what we call Parthian tactics. And so obviously they learned these and perfected these on the steppes of Asia. They were able to use these in a military sense as well. And so there are some Indians that are able to put up a pretty fierce resistance. The Rajputs, especially in the West, they really end up fighting a war of attrition against the Turks that drains both sides almost dry. The Turks didn't have as many problems with northern India. They were able to conquer most of that fairly easily. And so by dividing and conquering the larger Indian foes, eventually the successors of Mahmud of Ghazni are able to eventually take over large segments of northern India. Now, southern India remained independent. So we'll talk about the city-states that are there. But in northern India, basically at this point, the Afghanis will claim victory. And really, we end up with by 1027, 1030s, with really, for the most part, incursions that have taken large segments of northern India. By 1206, we have essentially the destruction of the last of the independent kingdoms, which is Bengal. And at that point, India's pretty most of it is effectively under the control of what becomes known as the Delhi Sultanate, so named because the capital is in Delhi. Even today, India's capital is New Delhi. Delhi is an area where there's a river crossing on the Ganges River. And so basically there's a lot of trade east, west, north, south that goes through it. So it's a centralized point that most trade has to go through. So that ends up being the capital. And really for the next 320 years, the Delhi Sultans will essentially rule from Delhi over much of India. It's technically 5 separate sultanates, but for the sake of this class, we basically just call it one. Because to talk about the Lodis and to talk about the Sikandar clan and to talk about the first rulers, it's rather complicated. And so to simplify, we usually just call it the Delhi Sultanate, or sultanates, I guess you could call it as well. So 320 years of history. Any questions on the Delhi Sultanate and how it is founded? So the question states, so they're kind of like the Mongols. I would say so. Yeah. I mean, again, they're all going to come from the same general area, which is the steppes of Central Asia. And so, the places today, they're like Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. So because of the steppes, yeah, I mean, they're wide open areas. There's not a lot of tree cover. So cavalry tactics are going to be supreme. So yeah, archery at a distance, weakening the enemy, and then, charges to break them up. Very similar to what the Mongols are going to do. Question is, what's the difference between a Mongol and the Delhi Sultanate? Well, Mongols were a different group. So obviously Mongols were further to the east in the area we refer to as Mongolia. The Delhi Sultanate's leaders and the Turks that came out of that area, they were from the further in the west. So they would have come from different areas geographically, but they were tribal peoples, they were cavalry peoples, and basically they were herdsmen who lived on the steppes of Asia. And they were tough people, and that tough mentality allowed them to be successful. Other questions? Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the next part, which will look at the geography. So Delhi Sultanate, you can see that the early attacks, this is really the founding of the dynasty in the 1200s on the far left. And then in the middle, you can see its greatest extent. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the final dynasty, which is that of the Lodis, who are really the last of the Delhi Sultans. And it kind of breaks into independent parts. So just remember this or come back to this as we talk about its history. It'll help you to kind of understand geographically what's going on. All right, so the Delhi Sultanate. First of all, the majority of people who lived in the Delhi Sultanate were Indians, and most Indians were Hindus and subscribed to the religion we know as Hinduism. So you're looking at about 90%. The peoples who conquered India, right, the Afghanis, they are going to be largely Muslim. So you've got a very small group that is ruling over a much larger group, right? And so that's one of the things that's going to characterize the Delhi Sultanate. In order to maintain their power, the small group is essentially going to be very, uh, they're going to have some very stringent rules. One of those, for example, is what's called the infidel tax or the jizya. We talked about this, I believe, with the Abbasids, but basically the jizya is up to 6% of your total income would go as a tax. And if you paid that tax, then you as a Hindu could continue to worship your Hindu gods. So you could worship whatever religion you so choose, but you're going to have to pay a tax in order to do so. So because obviously most people are Hindu, it's going to raise a substantial amount of wealth for the dynasty. As far as state protection for Buddhists and Hindus, not much. Really, the tax only gives you the freedom to practice the religion. It doesn't protect you. So if somebody wants to beat the crap out of you or do something bad to you, chances are the state's probably not going to do a lot to support you. So this is a problem. Really, how much power does the Delhi Sultanate have? We don't really know. Probably local leaders and local provinces were really running most of the day-to-day effects as far as collecting taxes and military security. The Delhi Sultanates just kind of collected a piece of the action, but there were some strong sultans who decided to micromanage. Like we'll talk about Alauddin, who largely micromanages the empire, but for the most part, it kind of runs on autopilot. And there's a lot of dynasties that are like this. As far as the geography, the Deccan Plateau, this largely isolates northern India from southern India, and the Delhi Sultans never made strong inroads into southern India. They, for the most part, were stopped. So southern India will have its own unique culture, languages, etc. You also had the Marathas, people who lived in central India who were able to keep the Delhi Sultans at bay because of their ability to fight back. So not everyone's going to fall to the Delhi Sultanate. Delhi Sultanate really is largely focused in just northern India. They also had issues from internal problems. So this is probably the biggest problem of the Delhi Sultanate was that there was no clearly agreed upon manner of succession, meaning that when you died, there was no guarantee that your son was going to take over the throne. The Turkish peoples that founded the Delhi Sultanate were tribal peoples. And as a result, anyone could challenge to be leader of the clan. And so because of this, there was typically anarchy upon the death of a leader. And when that happened, usually all the sons would go to war with each other. So you could pretty much guarantee that every time there's a succession, there's also going to be a civil war that accompanies this. Well, just put it into context, here in the United States, we've had one civil war, which took place from 1861 to 1865, and people are still talking about it. We still have issues with Confederate flags. We still have people who think the South's going to rise again. We still have people on the northern side who think that Southerners are evil. That happened hundreds of years ago. So, and that's just in the US one time. So imagine you had a civil war, every 20, 30 years. Every time a ruler steps down, you've got a civil war. So you get an idea of how difficult it was to rule the Delhi Sultanate and some of its problems as far as security for the throne. It just didn't exist. Most of the sultans would typically die by assassination most of the time. It's believed that among the leaders, only 5 or 6 of them are actually going to retire. Most of them are going to get killed. And a lot of times they get killed by their own family members who want to take power in their stead. So there's a lack of cohesion. There's a lack of ability of a son to take over for the father, and also extreme cruelty. Some of the Delhi Sultans, in fact, the majority of them were pretty mean to the majority of Hindus. Basically, beating them, punishing them, starving them. Basically, it's going to cause a lot of issues. The government, was very mean to the people, and the people didn't have a lot of loyalty to it. So all of those, I think, are reasons why we see that. Now, why? Because the Delhi Sultans are Muslim, and the Muslims believe that there is no other God but Allah. So to them, Hinduism is an affront. Hinduism, has all kinds of gods, and so it's looked at as being a kind of a pagan religion that's persecuted. And Delhi Sultans would regularly do this, especially if they had problems in their state they couldn't fix. The other issue that they had was the armies. The Delhi Sultans typically used Mamelukes for their armies. As mentioned before, Mamelukes were usually slave children who were taught, taken from their parents, and trained to fight. It's all they learned how to do. Once they, got good at it, they essentially would go and do all of the fighting for the Sultanate. But over time, they could become political. Once they became leaders, once they, had their own, armies that were under their command, that obviously gave them a bargaining chip to be used for future negotiations. So the reason that they use slaves for fighting is so that they could get around the ban on Muslims shedding each other's blood. Typically, it was believed that if you had a soul and you killed another Muslim, then you would end up in hell. But to Muslim religion in this time, slaves didn't have souls. So there is no punishment for them shedding blood of other people. They're, once they die, they just go poof. They're just basically like, what do you call it? Flour. They just poof into the air. They're done. So as a result, you could use Mamelukes to get around these bans. It was a creative way of being able to fight. Because let's say that you're about to besiege an enemy's castle, and this is the final stronghold, and you're going to win the war, and then Ramadan sets in. Everybody has to declare peace. So you can have the slaves do the fighting for you, and then that way you get around any potential problems that you would face as a devout Muslim. So everybody understand the purpose of using slave armies? And as far as loyalty, you never know whether or not your relatives are going to betray you, especially in the Delhi Sultanate, where everybody's getting poisoned or whacked. So slaves that are loyal to you personally because you give them food and shelter and prominence within the state, they were literally trusting total strangers more than they would trust their own people. And that certainly is a problem within the dynasty as well. Questions? Culturally, it's kind of a mix of both Hindu and Iranian culture. You see Persian and Hindu culture mixing together. Again, the Indians are going to adopt words from the Turkish languages, which eventually is going to create the language we know today as Urdu. There's a lot of things mixing religious-wise. The buildings, even buildings like the Taj Mahal later under the Mughals, is going to have a lot of Persian influence. So architecture, government, politics, all of those are going to be kind of a mix of both local Indian tradition, but also what the Delhi Sultans were doing as well. And even the deep-seated conflicts even today. Pakistan and India still hate each other. They both have nuclear weapons, and it's the one war that nobody talks about. We're obviously worried about what's going on in Ukraine with Russia, but I mean, Pakistan and India have been fighting for years over the control of Kashmir, and they're both nuclear powers. So even a small scale nuclear exchange between those two countries could obviously have some massive worldwide effects. So, it's one of those things that's a long lasting significance of the Delhi Sultanate, the cruelty of the Muslims and power, and then of course the Hindus who rejected their rule outright. All right, so some notable sultans. The first of which we'll take a look at is Alauddin. I know when you think of this, you probably think of Aladdin, right? The guy, the likable thief who ends up riding on the magic carpet with Jasmine. I mean, same name, not same guy. Certainly, Alauddin was a ruthless tyrant at best. First of all, he ends up coming to the throne because he murders his uncle. He ordered a series of massive military incursions into southern India. He used to essentially murder all the intellectuals because they would tell him things he didn't want to hear. All of these were a big part of how Alauddin basically made the nobles dependent on him personally. So where most Delhi sultans would let the state kind of run itself, Alauddin had his fingers in everything. He was basically, involved in finance. He was involved in the military, all of those things. And so eventually he did some pretty hardcore moves. One of them was to forbid all Hindus to own weapons of any kind. He also forbade them to own horses. This was really for obvious reasons, in that if you disarm the populace, they're easier to control. This is why in the United States we have a Second Amendment. It really doesn't have a lot to do with defending your house. It has to do with being able to defend yourself against the government, because the founding fathers were very suspicious of governmental tyranny. And that's certainly what you see here. Alauddin was able to disarm the Hindus, and then that allowed him to basically do whatever he wants to them at that point. So he was despised. Certainly the merchants, the Hindus hated him, didn't like him. He was cruel, he was unpopular. But right, he does have one positive, and that is he's able to fight off the Mongols. The Mongol invasions take place in the 1300s, 1200s, late 1280s, 1290s. And when they invade India, they hit a brick wall. The Delhi Sultans are strong enough, especially Alauddin personally, he's able to defeat them. He's able to use these massive armies that he's raised by upping the jizya tax and, taking all the money and weapons from the Hindus. And he's able to do that to keep the Mongols out. So it's one of those things, does the end justify the means? Can he be cruel and murder his own people, but he keeps the Mongols out? So that's kind of his legacy. Unpopular, very cruel, but keeps the Mongols out. And that's really the prominent thing that we remember from Alauddin, right? So here's a Mameluke soldier. All right, these are what the Delhi Sultan's warriors are going to be equipped with. Obviously spears, shields, similar to what we saw with the Islamic empires. And Mamelukes heavy cavalry. Here you can see them wearing chainmail, lamellar armor, obviously horses wearing barding armor as well. This is essentially their heavy cavalry they would use to basically run over the enemy. They also had light cavalry that they could use for pursuit, like the guy you see here, who basically horse archers that could harass the enemy and force them into positions that would allow them to be successful. And then lastly, here you have Alauddin. So the guy who repels the Mongols, definitely a powerful feat. There weren't a lot of places that did. India and Japan are really about it. China gets conquered, Russia gets conquered, large parts of Europe get conquered. Pretty much most of the Middle East gets taken over, but India doesn't because of the strength of the Delhi Sultanate, at least at that time. Future leaders weren't as successful. The Tughlaqs, for example, Muhammad Tughlaq is the founder of the dynasty. He's actually the son of a Turkish slave and a Hindu woman. So he's got mixed ancestry. But even though he had mixed ancestry, he still was not really a friend to Hindus. 1325, he became rather impatient. He was trying to take power. His father would not give him power for one reason or another. So he ended up building a large pavilion. It's like a big tent. And he had his father and all of his advisors there for a meeting. And then it just so happens that the tent fell apart. Yeah, sounds a little suspicious, right? So again, nobody can directly implicate that he did it. We probably can today, but supposedly it was an accident. But it was an accident that very much favored Muhammad Tughlaq. So basically he ends up killing his dad, probably. And by doing that, he ends up becoming a strict Muslim, probably because of an outgrowth of, of what do you call it, the doubt and fear over what he had done. Probably felt a lot of guilt for that. He also ends up setting up a temporary capital. There's a massive drought that takes place from 1335 to 1342. Over 1 million people starve during that. The Delhi Sultans make sure that the grain is all taken from the countryside and the government gets fed first. And then whatever's left over goes to the people. So the people are actually like raising the crops and they don't even get to really like benefit from it. You have revolts. Bengal ends up breaking away from the dynasty at this point, and Muhammad ends up being killed in battle during that revolt in 1351. His cousin ends up taking over. Firuz Tughlaq is probably a little bit more constructive. He ends up building gardens, palaces, schools, hospitals, mosques all over. He abolishes torture. He cuts back on the secret police that Muhammad had used. Still religiously orthodox, doesn't believe that the Hindus should be able to worship as they choose. But for the most part, he isn't, outright killing them like his predecessor did. 1398, the invasion of Tamerlane takes place. Temur the Lame, as he was known, was a ruthless conqueror and very devout Muslim who went on a campaign of world conquest that resulted in the deaths of possibly 5 to 8% of the entire world's population. Deaths in the hundreds of millions, probably. Tamerlane was picked on as a child because he was lame. He had a limp. And this was probably a congenital defect of some kind. And he obviously took this with him. And when he became an adult and was in charge of armies, he became extraordinarily ruthless. He, I believe, saw it that it was his duty, especially as India, because we're talking about in the scope of the Indian invasion, but other places as well. I think he believed that it was his duty to annihilate infidels. His belief was that Islam was the true religion and that all other religions were not desirable. There was no reason to have them. So he would basically invade countries, force people to convert, and if they did not, then he would murder them. And in India, this is certainly true. He fights a massive battle against the Delhi Sultans. The Indians obviously deploy their war elephants, which are usually their primary arm to defeat the enemy. Tamerlane was ready for this. He basically had cannons, right, that he used. And also, the other thing that he had besides gunpowder weapons was, you ever heard the expression, the straw that breaks the camel's back? So what he would do is he would take straw, load them up on camels, and then they would proceed to light the camels on fire. Well, obviously, what are things that elephants don't like? Number one, they don't like loud noises. A camel that's burning to death is going to make some pretty awful noises. Number two, they don't like things that are moving very quickly. Something that's on fire, it's going to move fast. And lastly, of course, elephants don't like mice. Well, yes, they probably don't love mice, but even more than that, fire. Yeah, they really don't like fire. So they end up freaking out, and the elephants, being prey animals, they end up trampling their own troops. So this leaves a large hole that Tamerlane is able to exploit, and that's how he's able to defeat the Delhi Sultan's armies. So he enters Delhi. He ends up taking it over. Large slaughter follows. We don't know how many people actually get killed, but it's tremendously large. We know at least 100,000 are killed during the storming of Delhi. Stories of soldiers wading in blood. We think that at least several million die during the Tamerlane invasion in India. So he does end up taking areas, but he doesn't hold on to them for very long. Gujarat breaks away. Several other places break away because they know the Delhi Sultans can't protect them anymore. And here you see a depiction of Tamerlane's victory, obviously the elephants being spooked, and then, of course, his men charging in on horseback to finish up the job. Here you see Tamerlane, who is probably the world's largest systematic mass murderer. Genghis Khan's up there too. I don't know which one actually probably has killed more. Genghis Khan was more about rape. In fact, as we talked about with the Mongols, there's a story that like 10% of the world's population like shares Genghis Khan's DNA because he basically got around. But Tamerlane was more about murder. He would just basically kill everybody that he thought was religiously inferior. So yeah, 5 to 8% of the entire world's population gets wiped out as a result of Tamerlane's campaign. It's pretty heavy stuff. Questions? Does it kill the dynasty? No, but kind of like with the Byzantines in the Fourth Crusade, there's no recovery. It's there's some recovery, but it's not to the point where it ever becomes a powerful dynasty again. I think Tamerlane really kind of takes most of the energy out of the dynasty. The next rulers are essentially the Lodi clan of Afghan leaders, Afghan descent, and they take power in 1450 after all the chaos of Tamerlane. Tamerlane had already been responsible for the murder of 3 to 8 million Indians, and then you had droughts that took place because Tamerlane's soldiers destroyed the crops on their way. So you had who knows how many people died in India during this period. It was a lot. But basically, you have the Lodis who try to restore order and power, and they have a tough time of it. You have the Bhakti religious movement, which begins during this era, simply because it's a chaotic time, and in times of chaos, people want to turn to spiritual matters. We also have the arrival of the last of the Lodis, which is Ibrahim, and he ends up essentially getting a series of massive invasions from a variety of different directions. People from Gujarat, people from the Northwest, but most potently, a group of Central Asian nomads, another Turkish group who are known as the Moguls, basically cousins of the Mongols. And they get essentially a second crack at India following the Tamerlane invasion. And so they end up taking over large segments of it at the Battle of Panipat, 1526. Babur ends up being outnumbered 3-1 in that battle, but he's still able to defeat the Delhi Sultans. And really by 1526, the last of the Lodis has essentially surrendered. And so India will now be taken over by what's known as the Mughal dynasty, the first of which dynasties we'll cover in World Civ 2. So we won't really talk about it, but the Mughals were responsible for creating the Taj Mahal, creating large segments of the Urdu language. The Mughals are going to be a very powerful entity that will have some major effects on world history as well. So it's basically it for the Delhi Sultanate history-wise. Does anybody have any questions on the Delhi Sultanate? Why did Babur go to India? Well, it's complicated. Babur had always wanted to invade India, but he never really had a large enough army to do so. He also needed a pretext for the invasion. Otherwise, the people would turn against him. He gets that because what happens is the leader at the time, Ibrahim, was unpopular and people were breaking away. Most of India had already broken away into independent, provinces, districts, whatever you want to call them. And one of those was essentially there was a battle between the Rajputs and the Punjabs, and the people of Punjab brought in and invited the Mughals to come in and fight on their side. And that's how they basically got their invitation into the country. And of course, once they got there, they just stayed. Kind of like with the Macedonians and the Greeks, right, with Philip II. And they basically decided they were going to stick around. So that's why he gets invited in. And then at that point, he's able to found what's known as the Mughal dynasty. Mughal is Persian for Mongol. Other questions? All right, so characteristics, 35 sultans, 5 dynasties. Of those 35, 19 were assassinated. So obviously not a lot of people had a great retirement package. They tended to die very quickly. So in periods of unrest or strife, they would die in a row, 4 or 5 of them at a time. So the thing to understand is that this is the big problem with the Delhi Sultanate was it didn't have a lot of stability. And so the people who lived in India were always in flux, especially if you were one of the Hindu majority. And ultimately, you had to pay these crushing taxes. Famines were a regular thing. Invasions happened regularly. So all of these were things that the average peasant in India had to deal with during this time. Now, although that was what's going on in the north, in the south, there is a vibrant culture that is largely independent of the strife that's going on in the north. The south had kind of a semi-feudal system that basically was kind of structured with city states. You had all of these rivals that were basically fighting against each other. And for the most part, that's what you had with these kind of priestly kingdoms, these theocracies that were basically being established in southern India. Obviously, they sat on the trade routes between Africa and the East, and so that made some of them pretty powerful and wealthy as a result. But basically, they were able to construct these huge temple complexes in the south. And so we'll look at some of the cave complexes. We'll look at some of the things that southern India is famous for. One of the things we know is that they were temple builders. There are massive temples, particularly built throughout most of southern India. The Pallavas built them, the Cholas built them. The Chola are the dominant naval power from about 10th century to about the 1200s. They're probably the largest and most powerful of the different kingdoms in the south. But they had these massive cave complexes that were constructed for religious purposes. The Ajanta complex you can see here is one of these. And there were typically figurines, religious centers. housing for priests, that kind of thing. And they were usually just built straight into the countryside. Here you can see examples of some of the cave paintings. This one in particular is from a work that you may or may not be familiar with that's called the Kama Sutra, right? Kama Sutra is, again, adult-based class, is essentially a kind of sexual guide. And so for the most part, it was kind of a mix of a religious text, but also a kind of an instruction manual on pleasure. And so this was something that was found inside the caves. It was something that there were priests who specialized in this kind of thing for people who needed various kinds of sensual instruction. And so it's about as far as I'm going to take it. Everybody clear as far as what's going on? I don't think I need to explain it anymore. But for the most part, these are the kinds of things that are going on in southern India as far as the religious elite that dominates the state, the politics that are associated with it. Now, southern India also does have a couple of larger empires. You have, for example, Vijayanagara in 1336, which was a coalition of southern Indians. They were largely united to defeat the Delhi Sultanate. So the Delhi Sultans have the opposite effect. Instead of conquering southern India, they actually unify it together. And they, were able in the south to hold off for some time. Eventually, they ended up, fighting off the Delhi Sultanate until the 1400s ish, and then they ended up obviously falling, prey to the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals in 1565. As a result of the constant fighting, the status of women declined significantly. We know that in southern India, we didn't have purdah, which essentially is the concept of veiling women in public. That was something that did take place in the north because it was Muslim dominated, but didn't take place in the south because it was still Hindu dominated. And so eventually in 1565, the coalition Vijayanagara is basically taken out and taken over by the Mongols. Now, as far as the south, their architecture was, beautiful. The Dravidian architecture you can see here, you can see the stoneworking, which is second to none. Their temples are extraordinarily beautiful. They had gardens. They built these large, cave and temple complexes that stand the test of time even to this day. At their greatest extent, here you can see the size of the southern Indian empires. They were, sometimes including part of the Spice Islands in Indonesia, obviously taking over parts of Bengal at various points. There's an invasion of Sri Lanka that happens as well. But for the most part, they're going to be focused on the coast and in the south. Most of the north is going to be ruled by the Delhi Sultanate. Here you can see one of the larger temples. Again, the architecture, you can see the windows, you can see how it's constructed in southern India, especially it's what's called Dravidian architecture. And of course, temple columns that you can see here as well. All right. So this basically takes a look at the end as far as medieval India is concerned. We've taken a look at the south. We've looked at the north. Any questions on the history of southern and northern India and its importance? So the question is, so southern India was not unified. It was in a few instances. Vijayanagara was a unified southern India, and that was to resist the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughals. But most of the time they were separated. They were a variety of small kingdoms that frequently fought against themselves. Other questions? Everybody good? So some discussion questions to take a look at. Again, these are something to gauge your knowledge. Look at them, see if you can answer them. If you can't, go back over the lecture, take a look at the PowerPoint again, right? Reread the section. So that way you can make sure that you can, because you may potentially see these on a quiz and or test. What were some of the major problems of the Delhi Sultanate, right? Number two, compare and contrast the differences between North and South in India. And number three, do the ends justify the means in looking at medieval India? This is a good question. Did the Delhi Sultanate with all the abuse and all of the tortures that the local Indian peoples had to endure, but it kept the Mongols out. As we talked about, the Mongols killed off and, raped millions of people. So did it, was the, as far as the evil that they committed, but they did some good in like creating some stability because of their cultural achievements. Do those goods outweigh the evil that was committed? Something to think about as far as your justification. Again, there's no right answer, or wrong answer. It's just essentially to have a judgment and then back it up with evidence, which has been kind of the theme of the course since the beginning. Questions? Everybody good on India? Okay. Well, as always, I hope you have a wonderful day. Our final lecture will basically take a look at medieval China, and that will essentially round out the course. So have a great day, everybody. I'll talk to you later.